Hi there, I'm John McAdams, founder of the Big Game Hunting blog. In this video, I'm going to do a detailed comparison of the 28 Nosler and 300 Win Mag cartridges. Now, I think most hunters and shooters would agree that the 300 Win Mag and the 28 Nosler are both fantastic cartridges for certain hunting situations. However, while there is a lot of overlap in their capabilities, there are some major differences between those two cartridges that you need to be aware of. Now, unfortunately, and as is the case with many new high-octane cartridges like the 28 Nosler, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of marketing hype out there about the capabilities of that cartridge. And for this reason, the true strengths and weaknesses and the situations where that cartridge really is the best choice kind of get lost in the shuffle, especially when you're comparing that to a more established cartridge like the 300 Winchester Magnum. So in this episode, I'm going to investigate the 28 Nosler versus 300 Win Mag debate in detail and provide some insight into which one is the better choice for you for various hunting situations so you can make an informed decision on which one will work best for your needs. Now, before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now. Just click that red subscribe button below to make sure you don't miss out on any of my new videos about hunting gear reviews, cartridge comparisons, and more. Now, for more detailed information about popular hunting cartridges and what they are best suited for, click the link in the description below or go to huntingguns101.com to get a free ebook I have written on the best hunting calibers. As usual, we'll start with the history of the 28 Nosler and the 300 Win Mag. The United States entered a period of sustained economic growth after the end of World War II in 1945, and the manufacturing base that produced gigantic quantities of weapons for use during the war switched over to firearm and ammunition development for civilian use. For these reasons, those next couple of decades were a true renaissance of civilian firearm and cartridge development in the United States. That time period saw a flood of new centerfire rifle cartridges like the .223 Remington, the .243 Winchester, the .280 Remington, and the .308 Winchester. That same general time period also saw the start of the modern Magnum era when Winchester introduced a new line of belted Magnum cartridges that utilized a modified .375 H&H Magnum case. The big bore .458 Winchester Magnum came along first in 1956. Then Winchester followed up with the release of the .338 Win Mag and the .264 Win Mag during the next couple of years. All three of those cartridges utilized a .375 H&H case necked down, or up in the case of the .458 Win Mag, and shortened from 2.85 inches to 2.5 inches long. Designers used those shortened cases so that all three cartridges would fit in a standard length rifle action, which is the same as the .270 and the 30-06. Instead of the longer Magnum length action required by the original .375 H&H cartridge. Those cartridges were all commercially successful, but Winchester did not stop with them either. Remington sent shockwaves through the hunting and shooting worlds with the introduction of the 7mm Remington Magnum in 1962. That cartridge also used a shortened and necked down .375 H&H case and fired a 7mm or .284 caliber bullet. The new high-velocity 7mm Remington Magnum cartridge was a massive commercial success, and it quickly began to take market share away from the .264 Winchester Magnum. Winchester responded with the introduction of the 300 Winchester Magnum the following year in 1963. Built using a modified .338 Winchester Magnum case necked down to use a .30 caliber bullet, the 300 Winchester Magnum basically duplicated the performance of the other fast .30 caliber cartridges of the day, like the .308 Norma and the 300 H&H Magnum. Unlike those other .30 caliber Magnums, though, the 300 Win Mag utilized a shorter case that fit in a standard length rifle action, like those other new Winchester belted Magnums, as well as the 7mm Remington Magnum, offering a dramatic improvement in performance over the venerable 30-06 that also compared favorably to the 7mm Remington Magnum in certain areas. The 300 Win Mag was an almost instant commercial success for Winchester. Now, in fact, the 7mm Remington Magnum and the 300 Winchester Magnum are both among the most popular centerfire rifle cartridges in the United States to this day. However, there's another heavy-hitting Magnum cartridge that really sticks out from the crowd, the 28 Nosler. Nosler initially made a name for itself in the hunting community by developing revolutionary hunting bullets like the Nosler Partition, Nosler AccuBond, etc. Well, Nosler dove headfirst into the cartridge development world with the introduction of the new 26 Nosler cartridge in 2013. Now, the name 26 Nosler reflects both the name of the company as well as the first two digits of the cartridge bullet diameter, .264 caliber in this case of the 26 Nosler cartridge. Based on a slightly modified 404 Jeffrey case necked down to shoot .264 caliber bullets, the 26 Nosler was definitely in the running for the title of the world's most powerful 6.5mm commercial cartridge, like Nosler claimed in their marketing materials. Now, the 26 Nosler was a big enough commercial success that Nosler introduced the 28 Nosler, which fires 7mm or .284 caliber bullets, as the next addition to their line of Nosler proprietary cartridges in 2015. Like the 26 Nosler, the 28 Nosler also uses a modified 404 Jeffrey case that's necked down and shortened to fit in a standard 30-06 length action. They decided to use a 1 9-inch rifling twist rate for the 28 Nosler that's optimal for the long, high BC 7mm bullets like their 175 grain AccuBond long range bullet, which we'll talk more about here in a minute. Now, the result is a cartridge capable of launching those heavy for caliber and extremely aerodynamic bullets at muzzle velocities in excess of 3,100 feet per second. The cartridge is also capable of firing lighter 140 grain, 150 grain, and 160 grain bullets, approximately 200 to 300 feet per second faster than the old 7mm Remington Magnum. Not surprisingly, the flat shooting and hard hitting 28 Nosler is a favorite among hunters pursuing big game like elk who want a cartridge that offers excellent performance at extended range. So let's talk about now how the 28 Nosler stacks up to the 300 Win Mag specifically, and we will start with their cartridge sizes. So first, though the 300 Win Mag does have a slightly longer case of 2.62 inches versus 2.59 inches, both cartridges have the same overall length of 3.34 inches, which is the same as the 30-06, and both cartridges are designed for use in a long or a standard length rifle action. Now, they have slightly different rim diameters, 0.532 inches for the 300 Win Mag versus 0.534 inches for the 28 Nosler. They both use a larger diameter cartridge case and require a larger Magnum bolt face. Now, the 28 Nosler has a rebated rim while the 300 Win Mag does not. Since they are descended from different cartridges, the 300 Win Mag is descended from the belted 375 H&H, while the 28 Nosler is descended from the beltless 404 Jeffrey. The 300 Win Mag has a belted case, while the 28 Nosler does not have a belted case. Furthermore, it is important to note that the actual case diameter of the 28 Nosler of 0.55 inches is larger than the non-belted portion of the 300 Win Mag case, which is 0.513 inches. Additionally, the 300 Winchester Magnum has a 25-degree shoulder angle, while the 28 Nosler has a steeper 35-degree shoulder angle. So for all those reasons, the giant 28 Nosler case does have a slightly larger case capacity and can just hold more powder than the 300 Winchester Magnum. The 28 Nosler is also loaded to a slightly higher pressure of 65,000 psi versus 64,000 psi for the 300 Winchester Magnum. Bullet size is another one of the important differences between them. The 28 Nosler uses .284 caliber bullets, while the 300 Win Mag uses larger .308 caliber bullets. Everything else being equal, the smaller diameter 7mm bullets the 28 Nosler uses have a higher ballistic coefficient and a higher sectional density than the larger diameter bullets of the same weight from the 300 Win Mag. But the rub here is that the 300 Winchester Magnum generally uses heavier bullets than the 28 Nosler. For instance, the 28 Nosler most often uses bullets in the 150 to 185 grain range in factory loads. 150, 155, 160, 162, and 175 grain bullets are most common for that cartridge. The 300 Win Mag commonly uses bullets in the 150 to 220 grain range, with 150, 165, 180, 190, and 200 grain bullets being the most common. Now, sectional density is a measure of the ratio of the diameter of a projectile to its mass. All other things being equal, a heavier projectile of a given caliber will be longer and have a higher sectional density and penetrate deeper than projectiles with a lower mass and lower sectional density. Now, note that this only really applies as far as penetration goes when you're talking about bullets of similar construction. So this is a meaningful comparison when you are comparing, say, two Nosler partition bullets to each other, but not, say, a 200 grain Nosler partition to a 150 grain E-tip or something like that. Now, 150 grain and 175 grain .284 caliber bullets have sectional densities of 0.266 and 0.310 respectively. This compares favorably to 150 grain and 180 grain .308 caliber bullets, which have sectional densities of 0.226 and 0.271 respectively. However, while the 28 Nosler tops out with those 175 grain bullets, the 300 Win Mag is capable of firing 200 grain, 208 grain, and 220 grain bullets with sectional densities of 0.301, 0.313, and 0.331 respectively. Now, the exact details vary, and we'll talk more about this later, but the heaviest and most aerodynamic bullets commonly used by the 28 Nosler have a higher BC than the most aerodynamic bullets commonly used by the 300 Win Mag. A good example here is that .284 caliber 175 grain Nosler AccuBond long range. That bullet has a G1 ballistic coefficient of 0.648, which outclasses the 30 caliber 190 grain Nosler AccuBond long range and 30 caliber 200 grain Hornady ELDX, which both have a G1 BC of 0.597. It also outclasses the 30 caliber 200 grain Federal Terminal Ascent, which has a G1 BC of 0.608. Furthermore, the gigantic case capacity of the 28 Nosler allows that cartridge to fling those very heavy, high BC bullets at a very fast muzzle velocity. Now, this translates into a flatter trajectory, less wind deflection, and more energy retained at longer range. So let's talk about the ballistics of these two cartridges in a little bit more detail. First up, our 28 Nosler loads use 155 grain terminal ascent with a 0.586 BC, 160 grain partition with a 0.475 BC, and those 175 grain AccuBond long range bullets with a 0.648 BC. We'll compare those to 300 Win Mag loads using a 165 grain Hornady CX with a 0.440 BC, a 190 grain Nosler AccuBond long range with a 0.597 BC, a 200 grain partition with a 0.481 BC, and a 200 grain terminal ascent with a 0.608 BC. Now, the Nosler AccuBond long range loads use heavy for caliber, very high BC bullets for each cartridge, and the partition loads use heavy for caliber, very tough bullets with a lower BC for each cartridge. The situation is a little different with those terminal ascent loads though. The 300 Win Mag terminal ascent uses a very heavy, high BC bullet, while the 28 Nosler terminal ascent uses a relatively light for caliber, but still fairly high BC bullet. Now, interestingly, that particular 28 Nosler terminal ascent loading is the flattest shooting 28 Nosler factory load currently available. It's also one of the lightest bullet weights available in a factory load for that cartridge. Now, Nosler does make a 150 grain E-tip in 28 Nosler that's a little bit lighter, and it is almost as flat shooting as that terminal ascent load. So with that in mind, I decided to add that 300 Win Mag Hornady Superformance loading to the comparison. Firing a 165 grain CX bullet at a blazing fast 3,260 feet per second, that particular loading is the flattest shooting 300 Win Mag factory load I could find, and I included it in order to compare the flattest shooting loads for each cartridge. And before you ask, no, 28 Nosler is not currently available in Hornady's Superformance line, otherwise I would have included it in this comparison. This whole comparison is a little bit different from most of my other cartridge comparisons because of the limited bullet offerings available for the 28 Nosler. This made it a little bit more difficult to do an apples-to-apples comparison for the cartridges, but I think these 7 loads are a pretty good representation of the performance of the 28 Nosler and the 300 Winchester Magnum. Now, when you have a 200-yard zero for all of those loads, The 28 Nosler has a flatter trajectory across the board. Interestingly, all three 28 Nosler loads have a very similar trajectory with about 1 inch in difference in bullet drop at 500 yards between them. That high velocity 165 grain 300 Win Mag comes close though, with just 0.8 to 1.9 inches or 2.5 to 6.1% of difference in bullet drop at 500 yards compared to those various 28 Nosler loads. However, that 300 Win Mag load is also starting to run out of steam due to the lower BC bullet it uses, and it has 2 to 20% less kinetic energy remaining than all of the 28 Nosler loads at that range. That particular 300 Win Mag load hangs tough with the 28 Nosler because they all have one characteristic in common: a very high muzzle velocity in the 3100 to 3260 feet per second range. All of the other 300 Win Mag loads in this comparison fire heavier bullets, and their muzzle velocities range from 2,750 feet per second to 2,870 feet per second. Now, even though the 300 Win Mag loads used in this comparison, aside from that 165 grain load, fire heavier bullets, their slower muzzle velocity results in a more arcing trajectory and, for the most part, less kinetic energy at all ranges. That 400 to 500 foot per second difference in muzzle velocity is a big difference, and the results are stark. That 300 Win Mag load firing 190 grain AccuBond long range has the flattest trajectory of the 300 Win Mag loads, once again aside from that 165 grain load, but it still has 7.2 inches or about 22% more bullet drop at 500 yards than the most arcing 28 Nosler load. The results are similar when it comes to retained energy, with the fastest loads having the most muzzle energy. Depending on the exact bullet we're comparing, that gap will either grow, like with the high BC 175 grain Nosler AccuBond long range for the 28 Nosler compared to everything, or potentially shrink a little bit, like with that 200 grain terminal ascent and 190 grain AccuBond long range for the 300 Win Mag compared to the 160 grain partition for the 28 Nosler. That 175 grain AccuBond long range load from the 28 Nosler really stands apart from the crowd, with by far the most retained energy remaining at 500 yards. 13 to 22% more than the other 28 Nosler loads and 15 to 43% more than the various 300 Win Mag loads. And it has very nearly the flattest trajectory, which is only eclipsed by the 155 grain 28 Nosler terminal ascent load by less than 1 inch. Heck, that particular 175 grain 28 Nosler load carries over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy out past 200 yards. Now, the differences between these cartridges become even more apparent at longer range, like when you compare those same loads at 600 to 800 yards. Now, I'm not saying that you should personally use either a 28 Nosler or a 300 Win Mag for hunting at really long range. That's a sensitive topic, and very few people have the skill to ethically shoot a deer or an elk at extended range. That said, this is an area where the 28 Nosler really starts to shine. That 175 grain Nosler AccuBond long range load in particular really sticks out as an outstanding choice at longer range. First, with 1,617 foot-pounds of retained energy out at 800 yards, it is the only load of the 7 that still surpasses that 1,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy minimum that many people consider a good rule of thumb for elk hunting. Both terminal ascent loads and the 190 grain AccuBond long range load for the 300 Win Mag come close, but they dip below that threshold between 700 and 800 yards. In that vein, that 165 grain 300 Win Mag load, which started off so fast, really continues to lose steam due to its lower BC as the range increases. Now next, that kinetic energy advantage that 175 grain 28 Nosler load has over the other 28 Nosler and 300 Win Mag loads gets even larger out at 800 yards. It has 18 to 41% more energy than the 28 Nosler loads and 20 to 68% more energy than the 300 Win Mag loads. Now next, while that 155 grain terminal ascent load does have the flattest trajectory, 1 inch in difference of bullet drop at 800 yards between that load and the 175 grain load for the 28 Nosler is absolutely minuscule. Otherwise, that 175 grain AccuBond long range really stands apart from the rest of the crowd in terms of trajectory. Now, at the same time, the 28 Nosler terminal ascent load is neck and neck with the 300 Win Mag terminal ascent in terms of retained energy. But the 300 Win Mag is going over 200 feet per second slower and has more than 3 feet of additional bullet drop at 800 yards. Now, that 190 grain 300 Win Mag AccuBond long range load has a very similar velocity and amount of kinetic energy compared to the 200 grain 300 Win Mag terminal ascent, but the 300 Win Mag AccuBond long range has about 6 inches less bullet drop at 800 yards. However, the 28 Nosler AccuBond long range load is going over 250 feet per second faster than the 300 Win Mag AccuBond long range, has 30 inches less bullet drop, and an additional 300 foot-pounds of energy at 800 yards. Additionally, don't forget about the importance of impact velocity. At really long range, there's a real concern that some bullets won't impact going fast enough for reliable expansion. As a rule of thumb, the Hornady CX needs about 2,000 feet per second of impact velocity. The Nosler partition needs about 1,800 feet per second of impact velocity. And the terminal ascent and the Nosler AccuBond long range each need around 1,350 feet per second of impact velocity for good expansion. With that in mind, the 200 grain partition dips below 1,800 feet per second between 500 and 600 yards. The 165 grain CX is barely going fast enough to expand at 600 yards, and the 160 grain partition dips below 1,800 feet per second, just shy of 800 yards. However, both AccuBond long range and terminal ascent loads for the 300 Win Mag and 28 Nosler are still going fast enough to reliably expand past 800 yards. Again, I'm not advocating long range hunting here. That's a completely separate topic. However, I think the 28 Nosler does really offer a massive improvement over the 300 Win Mag in that area, though, for those that have the desire and skill to do that sort of hunting. Now let's talk about the wind deflection characteristics of those cartridges. Similar to the situation we just discussed with trajectory and kinetic energy, the 28 Nosler has a definite advantage over the 300 Win Mag in terms of wind deflection. That's especially true that high velocity, high BC, 175 grain AccuBond long range load for the 28 Nosler. Additionally, the 165 grain 300 Win Mag has pretty lackluster performance here. It was hanging close to the 28 Nosler in terms of trajectory due to its high muzzle velocity, but the low BC of the bullet really hampers its performance in the wind. Now, the differences between the cartridges in terms of wind deflection are even more pronounced at longer range. It's a whole lot easier to correct for bullet drop these days using a laser rangefinder and an adjustable scope turret than it is to estimate the correct wind direction and speed to calculate a wind hold. Dealing with the wind is always tricky, and it gets exponentially more difficult as the range increases. For this reason, wind bucking cartridges like the 28 Nosler that help the shooter deal with wind estimation errors can absolutely help the shooter battle environmental conditions and result in better shot placement at longer range. Well, that 175 grain AccuBond long range 28 Nosler load has only a little bit more wind drift at 800 yards than the two best 300 Win Mag loads have at 700 yards. The case is similar with the 28 Nosler terminal ascent load. With this in mind, which one would you rather be shooting at an animal at longer range if there's any wind at all? Now, I think it's pretty clear that the 28 Nosler really has a big advantage in this area, especially as the range increases. Now, external ballistics are important, but they don't tell the whole story though, and there's more to picking a hunting cartridge than just comparing kinetic energy, bullet drop, or wind drift at various ranges. So let's talk about recoil. And specifically, we'll compare the recoil of the Nosler AccuBond long range loads with the 190 grain and 175 grain bullets for each cartridge. When shot from identical 7-pound rifles, both cartridges have a pretty stout recoil, but the 28 Nosler does have a little bit more recoil than the 300 Win Mag with this particular loading. Now, it's true that 175 grain Nosler AccuBond load looks really good on paper, but that performance does come at the price of more recoil. That load fires a little lighter bullet at a much faster velocity and uses a lot more powder to achieve that performance. All things considered, the 28 Nosler has about 6.5% more free recoil energy than the 300 Win Mag. Now, that said, even the 28 Nosler does not have a ridiculous amount of recoil. It's stout and it's getting up there, but it's also not so excessive that the cartridge is impossible to shoot. And it's also close enough to the 300 Win Mag in terms of recoil that a person who can handle the recoil of one should probably be able to handle the recoil of the other as well. And this can also be mitigated to a certain extent with the use of a suppressor, muzzle brake, good recoil pad, etc. So that extra recoil isn't necessarily a deal breaker for most people, but it is worth considering, and that is a slight advantage in favor of the 300 Win Mag. There are a couple of other factors that are also worth discussing though. So first, the 300 Win Mag uses larger diameter bullets than the 28 Nosler. Now the larger .308 caliber bullets used by the 300 Win Mag have just over 17% more frontal surface area than the .284 caliber bullets used by the 28 Nosler. All things being equal, a bigger bullet will make a bigger hole, cause more tissue damage, and result in more blood loss. So this is another advantage in favor of the 300 Win Mag. Now on the other hand, as we covered earlier, many of those longer, heavy for caliber .284 caliber bullets the 28 Nosler is optimized for have a higher ballistic coefficient than the most common bullets used in the 300 Win Mag, especially when bullet weights are similar. That's not a hard and fast rule though. For instance, .284 caliber 175 grain Nosler AccuBond long range has a BC of .648. That's higher than the .308 caliber 190 grain AccuBond long range, which has a .597 BC, and the 200 grain terminal ascent with a .608 BC. Now at the same time, Hornady makes a 28 Nosler loading in their Precision Hunter line with a 162 grain ELDX with a .631 BC, which is more aerodynamic than both 300 Win Mag loads in that same line with 178 grain ELDX with a .552 BC and a 200 grain ELDX with a .597 BC. On the other hand, there's a split decision with the 160 grain 7mm partition with a .475 BC, having a tiny bit higher BC than the 180 grain 30 caliber partition with a .474 BC, but not the 200 grain 30 caliber partition with a .481 BC. And of course, the 200 grain terminal ascent load for the 300 Win Mag has a higher BC of .608 than the .586 BC of the 155 grain terminal ascent loading for the 28 Nosler. Admittedly, that's a pretty light for caliber bullet weight for the 28 Nosler load. All things considered, the 28 Nosler does have an edge here with the heaviest for caliber loadings in that chambering, say, over 160 grains. Now, while those differences are indeed small in favor of the 28 Nosler, they're still worth considering because those slightly more aerodynamic projectiles don't slow down as fast and they're more resistant to wind drift. Now, what about accuracy? Both are certainly capable of outstanding accuracy in the right hands and in good rifles, and it's really hard to pick a winner here. On one hand, the 28 Nosler has great ballistics on paper, which can help the shooter battle environmental conditions and effectively place rounds on target. On the other hand, while the paper performance of the 300 Win Mag does lag the 28 Nosler, it also has less recoil, and that lower recoil of the 300 Win Mag can help facilitate better accuracy and help maximize the shooting abilities of the hunter using the cartridge to a little bit greater degree than the 28 Nosler. But on the other hand, the 28 Nosler can help the shooter battle environmental conditions to a greater degree than the 300 Win Mag when appropriate loads are used. The details will vary depending on the exact rifle, ammo, and shooter, but they both have excellent potential for accuracy. I'd give the edge to the 300 Win Mag at shorter ranges and under less demanding environmental conditions, and the advantage to the 28 Nosler at longer range and under more challenging conditions. Now, we can't talk about a Nosler cartridge without talking about barrel life, and there can be a pretty big practical difference in 28 Nosler barrel life versus the 300 Win Mag. Now, the 28 Nosler has a reputation for being rough on barrels, though not quite to the extent of the 26 Nosler. This is because the 28 Nosler uses considerably more powder than the 300 Win Mag does in a smaller sized space. This means in general, 28 Nosler will simply wear out barrels faster than the 300 Win Mag. Exactly how fast that happens will depend on factors like quality of your barrel, the exact ammo used, etc. Now, this can be an issue for hunters if they don't exercise care, and this is especially true for those who are using the 28 Nosler at really long range where small changes in performance and accuracy add up quickly. Details vary, but it's not unheard of for some 28 Nosler rifles to see a drop-off in accuracy after just a few hundred rounds. Others will last 800 to 1,000 rounds, but it's unusual to hear of them lasting much longer than that with full-powered ammunition, at least as far as providing really high-end accuracy. Now, typical barrel life for even the 28 Nosler is more than enough to last for many years of hunting with no issues. But exactly when the barrel becomes unusable depends upon the rifle as well as the hunter in question and what sort of performance they expect from that rifle. Those who want really tight groups for long-range shooting are probably going to want to change their barrel out sooner than those with a little bit lower standards. So all things being equal, the 300 Win Mag is probably going to have a better barrel life than the 28 Nosler. All right, so where do we stand with each one? The 28 Nosler fires smaller diameter, lighter, and often more aerodynamic bullets at a significantly faster velocity than the 300 Win Mag. The 28 Nosler has more recoil, a flatter trajectory, more resistance to wind drift, and carries significantly more retained kinetic energy downrange than the 300 Win Mag. All right, next, let's talk about ammo availability. Now, of the two, the 300 Win Mag is definitely the more popular, and it's usually among the top 10 most popular cartridges in the USA each year. 28 Nosler is not quite as common or as popular, but I wouldn't say it's rare. Now, all the big ammo companies make 300 Win Mag ammo, and almost any popular hunting bullet and hunting line you can think of is available in the 300 Win Mag. This goes from, say, less expensive, less sophisticated stuff like the Winchester PowerPoint and the Remington Core Lock, all the way up to more sophisticated, more specialized stuff like stuff from Barnes, say Federal Premium's Terminal Ascent, Hornady's Precision Hunter line with the ELDX, etc. Now, as of late 2022, there are only a handful of 28 Nosler hunting ammo loadings though. First, it's available in the Federal Terminal Ascent line with that 155 grain Terminal Ascent bullet and the Hornady Precision Hunter line with the 162 grain ELDX. Browning also now produces 28 Nosler ammo in their BXS line with the 139 grain solid copper and their BXC line with a 155 grain terminal tip. Those are both brand new loadings for 2022, and I don't know much about them other than the fact that they're available. Now finally, Nosler does produce 28 Nosler ammo in their trophy grade line with 160 grain Accubon, the Nosler trophy grade partition line with 160 grain partition, the Nosler E-tip line with 150 grain E-tip, the Nosler ballistic tip line with 160 grain ballistic tip, and the Nosler trophy grade long range line with that 175 grain Accubon long range bullet. During normal times, it's usually not too hard to find ammo for both cartridges, but that's especially true for the 300 Win Mag. Now, almost any gun or sporting goods store is going to have a pretty good selection of 300 Win Mag ammo in stock. But the 28 Nosler is a more niche cartridge, and you'll probably need to go to a larger or more specialized store to find 28 Nosler ammo in stock, as many smaller retailers and local stores probably don't carry it. In that same vein, 300 Win Mag ammo is typically noticeably cheaper than 28 Nosler ammo as well. Now, ammo availability is usually decent, and like I said, the bigger retailers typically have a good selection of factory ammo for both cartridges, but the 300 Win Mag is likely going to be easier to find and less expensive, even online. So bottom line, the average hunter is going to have easier access to ammo at cheaper prices for the 300 Win Mag compared to the 28 Nosler. The situation is similar with rifles. Now, of the two, the 300 Win Mag is once again the most popular, and it's available in, once again, almost every single bolt-action rifle you can think of. Remington Model 700, Winchester Model 70, Browning X-Bolt, the Tikka T3, the Weatherby, Vanguard, Christensen Arms Ridgeline, etc. Things are a little different with the 28 Nosler though, and it is primarily available in higher-end rifles, best able to take advantage of the long-range performance characteristics of the cartridge. Now, the 28 Nosler is available in rifles like the Christensen Arms Mesa, Ridgeline, and ELR rifle, several different versions of the Browning X-Bolt, several different rifles from Bergara, from Gunworks, and from Seekins Precision. And of course, Nosler offers the 28 Nosler cartridge in their M48 rifle and their new M21 line. And both of those rifles are also available in 300 Win Mag. So during normal times, the 300 Win Mag is the most common and the easiest to find. And the same thing goes for finding 300 Win Mag rifles that are less expensive, though the best, highest end rifles for both cartridges probably going to be about the same price. But in late 2022, We're still not living in normal times. The situation may be different where you live, and it has likely varied over the past 2 years, but as I record this in September of 2022, 300 Win Mag rifles are more common on dealer shelves than 28 Nosler rifles, at least where I live. And it's also important to realize that gun manufacturers tend to put longer barrels on rifles chambered in Magnum cartridges in general. This is because those cartridges need a longer barrel to effectively and efficiently burn that larger powder charge. That holds true for both cartridges, but especially the 28 Nosler. Barrel lengths vary depending on manufacturer and model, but 24, 26-inch barrels are pretty standard with the 300 Win Mag. On the other hand, the 28 Nosler is most common in rifles with a 26-inch barrel though. Now, the two cartridges are often available in rifles of the same size and length. Other rifles, sometimes chambered in 28 Nosler, may be slightly longer, heavier, and more unwieldy than those in 300 Win Mag. Just keep this in mind because sometimes that's a big deal. Okay, which one is right for you? We've talked about the history of the cartridges, their relative sizes, their ballistics, ammo and rifle availability. Let's get down to brass tacks here. Which one should you use? Now, do you primarily hunt medium game like white-tailed deer, feral hogs, or black bear at ranges inside 200 yards? Both are extremely effective deer hunting cartridges, and they'll absolutely get the job done on all that game if you do your part. There's nothing wrong with using either cartridge on deer or game like that inside 200 yards, but they're both really more gun than you need for that sort of work. Both are going to be rough on your shoulder and your wallet, at least compared to some of the other options out there, but the 28 Nosler is going to be harder on your shoulder and on your wallet than the 300 Win Mag. If you're going to be hunting in thicker brush or in, say, a deer stand like a box blind where your space is limited, remember what I just mentioned about the barrel length difference with those rifles? That extra 2 inches in overall length of a rifle can be a headache to deal with when you're trying to quickly and quietly maneuver for a shot. I would not say that really either is a good option for a truly compact rifle, but 300 Win Mag with a 24-inch barrel will be less difficult to handle than a 28 Nosler with a 26-inch barrel in a situation like that. Now, are you looking for a cartridge better suited for long-range hunting for game like mule deer or pronghorn in open country where you might need to take a shot at several hundred yards? Once again, they will both work really well in this role, and situations like these are where they tend to stand apart from other cartridges. The 28 Nosler carries more energy out to extended range than the 300 Win Mag, but the 300 Win Mag is still a really good choice in this role as well, and many loads carry more than 1,500 foot-pounds of energy out past 500 yards. Both of them have a very flat trajectory and really good resistance to wind drift compared to non-Magnum cartridges, but the 28 Nosler does have the edge in that area as well. Now, do you want a hunting cartridge that's well suited for hunting bigger game, caribou, moose, elk, eland, kudu, etc.? Both will work great when used on bigger game in North America, Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. If we're being honest with ourselves here, the 300 Win Mag is by far the more popular elk hunting cartridge, and it has taken way more elk than the 28 Nosler over the years, but that's really just because it's been around so much longer. But I say that as a way of saying that the 300 Win Mag is a great elk cartridge, and while the 28 Nosler is indeed more powerful, and we'll talk more about that here in a second, that's not to say that the 300 Win Mag is not plenty powerful enough to get the job done. Most hunters don't really need the capabilities of the 28 Nosler, and something like the 300 Win Mag will work great for the majority of elk hunting situations. I personally don't feel comfortable shooting game out past 450 yards myself, and the 300 Win Mag performs great out that far, and even a little farther in the right hands, and even on really big game like elk and moose. However, a person with the right shooting skills who wanted to extend their effective range by another couple hundred yards would be well served by the 28 Nosler. It's the clear winner for a hunter looking for a really good cartridge for use on bigger game, especially at extended range. Remember, there are certain 28 Nosler loads that have an additional 300 to 400 foot-pounds of kinetic energy than comparable 300 Win Mag loads out at several hundred yards. That 28 Nosler load with the 175 grain Nosler AccuBond long range is absolutely a better choice for those who want the most power, the flattest trajectory, and the most resistance to wind drift at longer ranges. And at the same time too, even if you're going to be hunting at a little bit closer range, say inside 500 yards, if your environmental conditions might be kind of tough, then that particular load for the 28 Nosler will give you an edge over those 300 Win Mag loads and help you battle the little bit of wind or something like that, just with a little bit less difficulty. Now, are you specifically hunting brown or grizzly bear? What if you hunt in Canada or Alaska or somewhere out west and you need a good heavy hitting cartridge in case you find yourself on the wrong end of a grizzly or a brown bear attack, like if you're out deer or elk hunting? I don't recommend either cartridge for actually hunting the big bears or other species of dangerous game like Cape buffalo, though they will work on the big bears in a pinch. I would prefer to carry something heavier like a 338 Win Mag or a 375 H&H in grizzly country, but I'd go with the 300 Win Mag over the 28 Nosler since it uses larger diameter and heavier bullets. You need to make sure you use premium, heavy for caliber, 180 grain, 190 grain, or ideally 200 grain bullets if you go that route though. Now, are you sensitive to recoil and you need a lower recoiling cartridge? Both cartridges have a fairly stout recoil, so I wouldn't say either one is a really great option for someone that needs a quote-unquote light recoiling cartridge. But the 300 Win Mag does have less recoil than the 28 Nosler. You should consider stepping down farther to something like a 6.8 Western or a 7mm rim mag if you want Magnum performance with even less recoil than both of these cartridges though. Now, the 300 Win Mag and the 28 Nosler are both outstanding rifle cartridges. While the 28 Nosler is a newer and more specialized cartridge that does offer certain advantages over the 300 Win Mag in some aspects, few hunters really need that extra capability offered by the cartridge, and there's still not a darn thing wrong with the 300 Win Mag either. And though the differences between them are fairly significant in certain respects, they're both suitable for many hunting tasks. I personally lean more towards the 300 Win Mag for the sort of hunting that I do myself. But like I said, there are people that hunt different game in different areas that are more skilled at shooting at long range than I am. And for those people, the 28 Nosler is a really, really good option. So you need to carefully analyze your potential needs before making a decision. In the end, a lot of this comes down to personal preference, the exact game you're after, and the conditions of your hunt. So choose the one you feel most comfortable with, and it will probably serve you well afield. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now. Just click that red subscribe button below to make sure you don't miss out on any of my new videos about hunting gear reviews, cartridge comparisons, and more. Now, for more detailed information on popular hunting cartridges and what they are best suited for, click the link in the description below or go to huntingguns101.com to get a free ebook I have written on the best hunting calibers. Now I'm going to turn it over to you. Which one do you prefer, the 28 Nosler or the 300 Win Mag? What game have you successfully taken with them, and what load did you use in that cartridge to take that game? Let me know by leaving a comment on this video right now. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and good hunting.